misinformation in the United States is eroding our information environment. It's polarizing society. It's hurting in a lot of different dimensions. But in places like African countries and Southeast Asia, misinformation is killing people.
Hello and welcome to Women with Balls, where I, Katie Ball, speak to today's trailblazers. Born in Iowa, my guest today graduated with a degree in electrical and computer engineering from the Franklin W. Olin College of Engineering. She went on to work for some of the most famous tech giants in the world, including Google, Yelp, Pinterest, and Facebook. Whilst there, she became shocked that the company seemed to, in her own words, harm children, stoke division, and weaken our democracy. Leaving the company in 2021, she became one of the most famous whistleblowers, leading to the Wall Street Journal's expose, the Facebook files. She has testified both in the US and UK about the harm she believes Facebook does to society, and continues to be a vocal advocate in holding big tech to account, all while the UK government's online safety bill progresses through Parliament. My guest today is Frances Haugen. So Frances, thank you very much for coming into the office today on this very, very hot day with, as you pointed out, a lack of air conditioning. On this podcast, we always begin by asking, would you describe yours as a happy childhood?
So I grew up in Iowa City, Iowa, which is one of these places that's like a town out of place. So my parents are from the coasts. My mother grew up in New York, outside of New York City. My father's from Berkeley, California. And they met in the middle in Iowa because that's where the University of Iowa is. And Iowa City is an amazing place to be, the child of two academics, because you have amazing freedom. Like my parents literally gave me a bus pass and let me wander around in the summer when I was 7. And you can do that safely because there's 100,000 people. There's 100,000 people in a town when school's in session. There's like maybe 25 or 30,000 people in town when the school's not in session. And so they have amazing schools. There's a remarkable number of early Facebook employees that were my classmates in my high school in Iowa. And I'm very grateful for the experiences I got to have there.
Now, your mother is a priest, so is religion a big part of your upbringing?
It's interesting. So my mother became a priest when I was in college. And so she was a life scientist. She was a cell biologist, a professor for 20 or 25 years. And in her 50s, she became a priest. And so religion was not like a huge part of my childhood. It was a thing that my mother really got into when I was in high school and then later on in college.
So. What were you already thinking about a career in tech? Or?
No, I don't think I ever intended to have a career in tech. I originally, all I knew is I wanted to be able to, so one of the downsides of living in an academic town is that you don't have a lot of paths to like what does it look like to be an adult, because a disproportionate share of the adults that you interact with are either like teachers in public schools, which is a great and very valuable career path, or they're professors, and often they have like Ivy League degrees. So there's this like very weird dichotomy of like, are you going to like go to a good school and you can have a job that supports yourself, or are you going to be a service worker? Right? It's not a diversified economy. And so my friends and I, we all had this very, very strong desire to do well enough in school that we could get into good schools. And I know there's lots of happy paths to staying in Iowa, but it was one of those things where I was exposed to a very shallow set of experiences. And so that's part of why I was so academically ambitious.
Now you go on to study electrical and computer engineering, and I just wanted, I guess for listeners, I can't quite remember when I grew up with Facebook. I think there was Bebo for a while.
Mm-hmm. Bebo was a thing.
So when you went to go and study this, it feels now as though it's quite obvious that there's, big tech and it's a huge, huge industry. What did it look like back then?
Oh, interesting. So when I was in college, most people aren't aware, so Facebook was founded in 2004. The big social network in 2004 was actually Friendster. So that was like probably the largest one in the world. And the only reason why today we don't know of Friendster is Friendster wasn't good enough at building the actual technical engineering, right? The math behind social networks is very, very expensive for computers. And Friendster grew so fast in popularity that the site became unusable. And there are these programs called crawlers, and crawlers, they're computer programs that walk across the web, the World Wide Web, and download content. And the first crawler I ever wrote, I wrote actually when I was studying abroad in Sweden in 2004. And it wasn't a Facebook, it was a Friendster, because Friendster was the cool thing then. And then the mid 2000s, like maybe 2006, the big social network was MySpace. And so the thing that Facebook really displaced was not Friendster, because Friendster kind of killed itself, but it displaced MySpace.
And when you're doing your degree, how did you find studying? Was it male dominated in your class, or was it a pretty good mix?
So I went to a very unique engineering experience, which was I went to a brand new engineering college, and so there were only 75 students in my entire college when I was a freshman. And because there were so few students, right, we all had full tuition scholarships. Because there were so few students, they could be very picky, and they intentionally had a 50-50 male-female balance because they had lots of strong female candidates, and there were like very few slots. And so Olin is the only engineering school in the United States that has more women than Olin is Smith, which is a women's school, a women's college. And so it's interesting. I didn't really experience like large amounts of sexism in tech until I got to Google. And so it was actually like a very rude awakening for me to show up at Google. And I think Google at the time was 12 or 13% women on the technical side. And so it's like I've been in this environment where it's always been, 50-50. And Wellesley, which is a women's college, is 5 minutes away. So I took 1/8 of my classes in college at Wellesley. And to move into an environment where there are almost no women. And so it was just a very, unexpected thing.
I mentioned instruction. You just mentioned, of course, Google, some of the places you worked before Facebook. So Yelp, Pinterest. I wanted so on graduating, what was your kind of way in to your first job?
Great question. So I had a very interesting job search in that when I graduated from college, my degree was unaccredited because I was part of the first graduating class in my college. And I originally intended to either get into grad school or I was going to go move home with my parents and do a startup, basically build a website or something. And so I applied to 55 jobs and I got three phone screens and I got 2 in-person interviews and I got 1 job offer, which is from Google. And I think the key thing I did not understand was that the only places basically that I got to interview were places where someone inside the company endorsed me, or where Harvard's admission team, they told Boston Consulting Group, they're like, you should interview her. And so I ended up at Google very randomly. I never expected to move to California. I'd always been raised with a father that had left California, so he had a lot of very critical opinions about California.
Was he impressed by your plan to go to California?
He was not super pleased, but it was the only job offer I got. And Google is a great place to start your career, even then.
Yeah, what was it like being in such a iconic but also very large organization so early on? Mm-hmm. Did you feel like a little bit like a small cog in a very big machine? Or
I really liked Google. Something that may not be obvious is that highly performant startups, really highly performant startups, and I think Google did a great job at this early on. Google felt like a very safe place, where it was a thing where people felt very secure about themselves, and so that it was very collaborative. And I loved being surrounded by just masters at their craft and getting to learn from that. And so I loved being at Google.
And I want to also talk about you moving to Facebook, but I wonder first, maybe just for our listeners, my husband is a coder and I couldn't actually tell you what he does every day. So perhaps you could just explain to listeners, when you were doing your job at Google, for example, what is a day in the life in terms of what you're doing?
So I did a couple different areas at Google. So I was a product manager. So product managers, so Facebook is a product, Instagram is a product. But even within, say, Instagram, the box where you create a new post, that itself is a product. And even the picker where you say this person, I'm with this person, that's a product, an even smaller product. And I started out at Google working on reporting for ads on AdWords. And then very soon after that, started my second year. So I was there for about 7.5 years. I started working on search quality. So search quality as a product is really different than what most product managers do, because most product managers, if you ask them, what did you contribute to this product, they can point at the button or at the screen that they were responsible for adding to that product. But when you work on search quality, a huge amount of your job is pulling out of the databases a bunch of things that people search for, and seeing what they clicked on, or seeing what does Google return for these results, or what results do they return for the search query, and just seeing if you see trends. Like, oh, interesting, like there's not enough diversity in the results on this page. Or, and by diversity, I mean, are we returning the exact same web page over and over again? Or is there a better result that we're not returning? And going in and trying some other strategies for trying to retrieve that information and figure out how could we get that onto the first page. Or it could be things like, how do we present that information? For some queries, maybe, queries like the actual things you type into Google's search box. For some queries, the best possible answer might be a 5-line snippet instead of a 2-line snippet. That's the text underneath the heading on each result. Or maybe the best result would be a picture. And I worked on Google Books for 4 years, working on search quality and doing some front-end changes. Later on, I did the same thing on Google+. And at the very end, I worked on the knowledge graph. So that's how do we describe the information that we show on Google.
And you obviously worked in various places, but I want to talk about obviously the move to Facebook. So why did you want to move to Facebook? How did it come about? Was it something you'd always wanted to work for, or not so much?
I never really had a hunger to work at Facebook. So something that most people are not aware of is if you have more than, say, 5 years of work experience in Silicon Valley, a Facebook recruiter will contact you every 3 months. Like, there's enough brand damage. They have to constantly be really, really working at it.
You get like nice lunches out of it?
No, you could. If you wanted to extract some lunches, you probably could. So they'll reach out to you and say, like, oh, have you ever considered working at Facebook? And, I think I was feeling maybe a little extra punchy or a little snarky the day the email came in. This is like January 2019. Because I was like, the only thing I would work on at Facebook is misinformation. And they were like, oh, well, by the way, like we have this brand new role. It's civic misinformation. And so it's 2019. It's like the lead up to the 2020 elections. I'm like, that's what, I had lived with. I had someone very close in my life who I lost to misinformation. So in 2014, I got really sick and I had to relearn to walk. And I hired this assistant the next year because I realized that I was still so weak. Like my life wasn't at risk anymore, but like I was still so weak that I wasn't strong enough to like carry boxes to clean out a storage unit, that kind of thing. And he became an incredibly close friend. So he would take me walking 5 days a week. He liked to lift weights. So he taught me how to like eat protein and like, how do you put on muscle, that kind of thing. And in 2016, after Bernie lost the nomination, right? So Bernie Sanders and Hillary were vying to be the Democratic candidate. After he lost the nomination, he just went deeper and deeper and deeper into these dark places on the internet over the next 6 months. And by the time the 2020 election rolled around, like he and I were having like 1,000-word emails back and forth on things like, does George Soros run the world economy? And I remember the day that he said to me, he's like, do you even read your own citations? These are all from the mainstream media. And at that moment, I realized like I had just completely lost him, right? Like if we can't even agree on the grounds that we can try to come to consensus, like there's no place, like there's no place for communication. And so when the recruiter was like, oh, you could work on civic misinformation, it was a super interesting idea to me because, losing him to, the depths of the internet was really, really painful for me. And I never wanted anyone to feel that pain.
So you joined Facebook on the misinformation brief. And so in that role, what is your job on a day-to-day basis?
I thought I was joining Facebook to work on misinformation in the United States. Right, so it's 2019, civic misinformation. Clearly, this is in prep for the 2020 elections. I don't know how no one ever explained this to me before I joined, but I actually was working on misinformation anywhere there wasn't third-party fact-checking. And misinformation in the United States is eroding our information environment. It's polarizing society. It's hurting in a lot of different dimensions. But in places like African countries and Southeast Asia, misinformation is killing people. And what was really, really shocking to me, even in the first few weeks I was there, was I thought I was a relatively well-read person. And I had no idea this was going on. And I think this is one of those things that's really important for us globally to talk about, which is these tech companies are huge and they're homed in Northern California. And the people who are building these products often lack international context. And the fact that Facebook went into some of the most fragile places on earth and bought the right to be the internet. So they went in there and said, hey, if you use Facebook, your data is free. If you use anything else, you're going to have to pay for it yourself. And enough people in those places converged onto Facebook as the internet. Because like, think about it, like even if a fraction of your internet users use Facebook as the internet, there's a convergence thing that happens where even people who pay for their data, things still end up on Facebook because of the network effects. And so today there's like 1 billion or 2 billion people for whom Facebook equals the internet. And I was like looking up some stuff last night, and there are a surprisingly high number of countries in the world where the fraction of people in that country that say, I use the internet, is smaller than the fraction of people who say, I use Facebook.
So when you're looking at, you come into your role and you're looking at what people in these countries would be seeing on Facebook.
Yep.
Is this fake news? Is it people kind of putting out lies? Is it the fact that it's not really? Is it based on articles on journalists' website, or is it something else?
So one of the big areas that I'm always pushing for is around transparency. And one of the reasons why I'm always like, we need to get access to the data, which is the top thing we need to fix in the online safety bill. The reason we need researchers to have access to the data is right now, if you or I were to talk about what is Facebook or what do people see on Facebook, the closest thing we get to being able to have evidence of like what is the gestalt, what is viewed on Facebook, is something called the most viewed content report. And the most viewed content report is so misleading, it is almost like a work of art, right? Because like you hear, most viewed content report, you're like, oh, this must be the most viewed content on Facebook. It only shows you the top 20 posts each quarter, only for the United States and only for English, right? That's a tiny, tiny sliver of all the users in the world. Only about 9% of users speak English. I have seen the most viewed content in the tier 1 at-risk countries. So at Facebook, there's this tiering system where they say, what are the places in the world most likely to have social media facilitated violence? Right. So we've had 2 genocides globally so far. They were greatly worsened by social media. Myanmar, where 200,000 people died, and Ethiopia, which is still unfolding. Tier 1 at-risk countries are the ones most likely to follow in that path. And every 2 weeks, the social cohesion team used to do a thing called the virality review. And the social cohesion team is the team responsible for preventing genocides, because ethnic violence happens when social cohesion breaks down. Like, it's very Orwellian. So this team used to do this thing every 2 weeks where they would bring in specialists who would translate for us the top 10 posts in each country in the tier 1. So this is like maybe 10 countries, 12 countries. And every single post in the most viewed content report was horrible. You know, it was allegations that your opponent abuses children. It would be gory scenes of violence that they would claim is happening in the next village over, but it would really be from 7 years ago and like 6 countries away. It really, really highlighted what happens when you have places where Facebook is the internet combined with algorithms that give the most reach, the most distribution to the most extreme ideas, combined with languages that Facebook has chosen not to support for safety systems. And when those 3 things all come together, you get information environments where people can't leave, people can't consent whether or not to use it, and the thing that is getting blasted out of these societies is violence.
And in your role, your misinformation, I think most people think, well, you're in a role where you're helping to combat that. Was that your experience?
Almost immediately, the thing I faced was there was a real gap. Because at Facebook, things are not meaningful unless they can be measured. But literally the thing that we had been told to focus on was misinformation where there is no third-party fact-checking. So clearly we need to work on this because there's not third-party fact-checking in most of the world. those places of violence didn't have third-party fact-checking.
And third-party fact-checking, what if you were in
sure.
the UK, America would be...
Oh, so they literally hire journalists, often from name brand publications, because there'll be programs embedded at those newspapers. I can't name them all off the top of my head. And those people will get access to a secret tool that only journalists get to see that lets you see the most popular stories on Facebook and the ones that are rising the fastest. And they will write up these little stories and do research to explain why these things are not true. So at Facebook, we were in this weird catch-22, which is we're supposed to work on misinformation in some of the most vulnerable places in the world. But nothing at Facebook is misinformation until a third party has said it's misinformation. So how do you measure success if you're not allowed to actually, you have no ruler? And so we worked on that for about 3 months, and then we were pulled off it to work on targeted misinformation that was being sent to people like police officers in the United States. So we literally basically they gave up on misinformation in places that didn't have third-party fact checkers, despite the consequences, and put us back on the United States after 3 months.
And how did that make you feel?
It was my first taste of how chaotic things are inside of Facebook. Like we look at it and we say, oh, back then it was $1 trillion company. Now it's a $500 billion company. We look at $1 trillion company and we say that is the pinnacle of excellence. And if people could see inside the company, they would see how remarkable it is that they've gone as far as they have.
Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, you are a whistleblower. So at what point then, you're obviously becoming very uncomfortable with the things you're seeing. Mm-hmm. You've been moved off of this. And I would presume from what you're saying that when you were moved off, were you frustrated to be moved off?
Well, that wasn't why I came forward. My decision to come forward happened a full year later. So, in some ways, we got escalated onto, in some ways, just as scary a thing, right? Like when misinformation is targeted at people like police, like we don't want the people carrying guns, or in the United States, the police carry guns. You don't want the people carrying guns living with a different reality than what is our shared reality. So I didn't feel bad that when we got moved onto it. It was an example of how dynamic things are at Facebook. The moment that I realized Facebook needed help, right, that it wasn't going to be able to solve these problems alone, like it needed help to solve these problems together, was about a little less than a month after the US 2020 election. Facebook announced we're dissolving our civic integrity team. So this is the parent team that I was part of. So I worked on civic misinformation under civic integrity. And a little less than a month afterwards, they came out and said, your work is so important that we're going to integrate you into all these other places in the company. And at Facebook, that's not how reorgs work, right? Like your team either eats other teams or your team is eaten by other teams. And I don't think I was the only one that felt that way, because the team that I got moved on to, every single product manager on the team quit in the same 6-week span, about 6 weeks later. Not 6 weeks, 6 months later. So I wasn't the only one that left about the same time. But the reason why I was like, oh my goodness, like this is a problem, was Facebook's bar for success was that there wasn't riots for the US 2020 election. Right? We still were facing genocide problems. We still were facing the algorithms giving the most reach to the most extreme ideas. But Facebook was like, oh, like we passed this crisis point. We don't need these folks anymore. And because they dissolved civic integrity, there was no one around to form the war room to turn the safety systems back on before January 6th. And at 5 p.m. on Eastern time on January 6th, the whole list of safety features. So this is not censorship. This is things like how much should you amplify live video, right? Like Facebook regularly has a problem with people committing suicide on live video or killing other people on live video. Like Christchurch in New Zealand was filmed on live video, broadcast on live video. The kinds of safety things that were off at 5 p.m. on January 6th were things like, should you amplify live video 850 times? Like more than it would have earned otherwise. Probably not if you can't control it. But because they got rid of civic integrity, no one was there to actually, raise the red flag and say we need to act.
So when when you?
That was an decision, yeah. And it took me a while to think through like how to do it. And so I'm working on counterespionage. So I was thinking very carefully as a data scientist, like how would I look for myself if I were like trying to find someone who was doing this? And so it took me a long time to figure out a plan that I felt confident in.
And were you able to seek advice from anyone, or not, because what you're working on is so confidential? It's had to be quite like almost a solo decision.
I had a bunch of time during 2020 to talk to my parents, because I lived with my parents during COVID, about the things that I was seeing at work, and to talk through like what might I do. And so by the time I decided to act, I'd had lots of time to become okay with the idea of acting. So the only people I talked to about it in great depth were my parents. I tried to reach out to, I'm trying to decide whether or not to name and shame them. I reached out to a large tech advocacy group, which will remain nameless to protect the guilty, and told them very early on. So back during the Iowa caucuses, I tried to talk to them about like what I was seeing, and they, because back then the conversation wasn't about how do we fix the algorithms, how do we look at the product choices that Facebook has made that have caused the most extreme content to get the most reach, because the only frame of reference at that point was the frame of reference that Facebook gave. They said the only things we can do to keep people safe are censorship. That tech advocacy group was not willing to help me at that time, because they're like, well, even if the public knew about these things, all they would do is censor them. And so I did have to do it on my own.
So you make the decision, you do it, and then what happens? Is there a point where I imagine if it's during COVID, are you working from home at this time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's not like you leave the office for the last time.
Yeah.
What starts to happen after you share the information?
And so things stayed very quiet for quite a long time. So it was only right in the lead up to the first article being published with the Wall Street Journal that my lawyers started talking to me about, like, do you want to be publicly, like you should think really hard about coming out publicly.
And had you stopped working for Facebook at this?
Yes. Yeah. So I stopped working for Facebook back in May. Yeah. And the first article came out in September.
And at that point, what do you find the public reaction to be? Were you ready for the scrutiny that comes with it? Or,
it's so funny. Like, I've been incredibly lucky. Like, I know how hard it's been for Snowden or for Reality Winner or like Chelsea Manning. Like, I know how hard it's been for people who have whistleblown on the federal government. There is not that level of allegiance or goodwill towards Facebook. And I think that's why, I don't even get sent mean messages on my DMs. Like I always say, like, I leave my DMs open. Like, if you want to be mean to me, you can. I do respond, but I usually ask you, could you tell me more? But people, I think I've had a very fortunate emergence into the public light, because people have been very supportive.
Now, since obviously you blew the whistle on Facebook, they faced lots of scrutiny,
Mm-hmm.
and I think lots of negative publicity. But I think just for the end of this, kind of moving to the present day, I wondered, first, do you think Facebook have learned any lessons yet? And then I want to ask you about the online safety bill.
So we have seen some changes in Facebook already, even without mandated changes. So the Digital Services Act just passed in Europe. And there are many changes that are going to be coming down the pipeline as a result of that. But even before being forced to do things like transparency, Facebook has launched some things that show that they have listened to at least some of the criticisms. So I'll give you an example. At any point in the last 10 years, they could have released parental controls on Instagram. At any point, right? People have been asking for parental controls forever. And these are things like saying, can you assign a time allowance to your kids? Because the reality is the kids that are most harmed by social media are the ones that have a negative relationship with it and then end up doom scrolling at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., right? Where their anxiety pulls them to engage more, but at the same time, the content is making them more anxious. Time budgets are important for kid safety. They didn't launch those until like 2 months ago. Like, there weren't really parental controls till then. Or Facebook has made some efforts to try to support more languages for its safety systems. Like, they announced in December that they were re-architecting how they did those so they could try to cover more languages.
Online safety bill currently going through Parliament. I recently actually had Nadine Dorris on this podcast, the Culture Secretary, who's leading the legislation. What do you make of it in terms of, I suppose, fairly briefly for our listeners, because obviously it's a very wide bill, but I just wondered what you think is good that it's doing and then where you think it actually is potentially lacking.
I think one of the places where the UK is really establishing a reputation around is it is very thoughtful about the rights of children and like safety by design and making sure that kids are safer, at least online, because the reality is the internet was not designed for children, and right now the people paying the highest costs, at least in our societies, for social media are children. Some of the places where it's a little weaker are things like there's a large focus on content versus focusing as much on systems. So the Digital Services Act out of Europe focuses more on, making sure there's transparency from day one. So that means academics, researchers, the regulator gain access to data from the start. The online safety bill says, we're going to do a 2-year period. Ofcom's going to do a 2-year period where they're going to ask the question, should we have access to data? We've known for 10 years we need access to data. Like we would never trust an oil company. Like if let's imagine some kids were sick downwind from an oil derrick. We would never turn to that oil company and be like, why do you think these kids are sick? And if they were like, have you seen the clouds in the sky? Have you talked to a meteorologist yet? Maybe it's the clouds. No. We would send an environmental scientist out there who would test the air, they would test the soil, they would test the water. And they'd come back and be like, no, like the oil derrick is like burning off this stuff and there's a byproduct in it. Like we wouldn't ask the person committing the harm to let us know what the solutions are. We would ask our own questions and we would do our own research. And until we have access to data, we cannot act independently. So the online safety bill has to move from saying, should we have access to data, to saying, how will we have access to data? And instead of it taking 2 years to start giving access, it should take 3 months. Because the Digital Service Act is going to have data on day one, starting in January.
Is the data almost looking at how things are targeted, and in that sense,
that would be one thing,
yeah.
Right? So it's a huge. It's things like what content gets the most promotion, right? Where are the biases? Where are the biases in the censorship systems? Right now, we have no idea how these things work, but Facebook's own documents say things like 75% of counterterrorism content in some languages is getting labeled as terrorism content and taken down. We need transparency to see how these systems work. Another place where I think the bill could be stronger is right now it's allowing the I think it's like the secretary. It's allowing a minister, an elected minister, to say what content should be taken down instead of having Ofcom do it. Ofcom is an independent regulator. We don't want to have an elected official who might have their thumb on the scale deciding what can and can't be said. We want the independent regulator to have that role.
Yeah, you mentioned that, and I think one of the criticisms that has been aired in the Spectator, but also in Parliament, is concerns over legal but harmful, and how that can be interpreted, how it could move, and whether actually it could be a threat to free speech, in the sense that you could say, if your argument that something could be harmful but it's not actually illegal, you can start to see how... Well, when Nadine Dorris was on the podcast, she was saying, as to your point, well, actually, some Twitter pylons would be okay. So a Twitter pylon about her would be okay, but a Twitter pylon if it was racism would not be okay. But I think lots of people think, well, in terms of the legal but harmful side, you're going to bring more in. I wonder, what do you think about that?
I think there's, when we look at, we said before about the greatest harms to, like, say, kids. A lot of the stuff that is harming kids is totally legal content, right? One of the things that Facebook's own documents say is, we like to think that Facebook is a mirror. Like when you poll people say, oh, Facebook's just showing me what's representative. In reality, Facebook is an amplifier, right? You can take a brand new Instagram account with no friends, no interests, and search for something like healthy eating, and just click on the content they give you. Follow the hashtag suggested and get taken to pro-anorexia content within 2 weeks. That kind of thing, an algorithm that pushes kids actively from just an innocuous thing like healthy recipes to pro-anorexia and self-harm content, because both those things are what Facebook found. we need to make sure there's some space in there where we can still make sure that those things get captured. And so I think transparency is a good complement, where it's one of these things where right now we don't know what content they take down or leave up. We should have an ability to see what's going on, and then we can put pressure and democratic accountability on the system.
Yeah, because I think one of the concerns is the idea that actually you could have a situation where, in a way, tech companies overly censor because they're incentivized so as to avoid being in trouble, take lots of things down. So if you're erring, just err on the side of caution. Do you think, I mean...
That's part of what...
I think that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
I don't know if you think...
Part of why I like... The only thing I've been recommending is around focusing on systems over content. So I'll give you an example. If you divide all the content available on Facebook into content you consented to, so that's things like your friends and family, pages you actually followed, groups you actually joined, versus something like your friend commented on something and now it's inserted in your feed. If you just give people more content they consented to and less that they didn't consent to, for free you get less hate speech, less violence, less nudity. So rules that say you must take down every piece of X, I worry that you can have effects like what you talk about. If you instead say things like, you need to show me, and this is part of how the Digital Services Act works. It says, you need to tell me what the risks are, and you need to walk me through how you're going to reduce those risks. And you need to give me data that should show me that you're making progress. That's a very different thing than saying every last thing that is X needs to be taken down.
Now, 2 final questions for me. The first was, we've been talking about Facebook largely, but I just wondered what you make in terms of on Twitter at the moment. Obviously, Elon Musk is in the process of potentially buying it, but I think there's yet to go through at the time of recording. And lots of people are saying, well, that's a threat to online safety. He obviously is saying he's a freedom of speech champion. From your side, he's also talked about publishing, the algorithm and things. From your side, what do you make of it in terms of that online safety debate?
So I get asked this question multiple times a day.
Yeah, sorry for not being more creative.
It's totally okay. I think it's a really important question for us to talk about. I sometimes get a little bit of flack for saying that I'm cautiously optimistic about it. But I'm not alone, right? Like, Jeff, did you see The Social Dilemma? So The Social Dilemma is the most popular documentary that's ever been on Netflix. It's about the dangers of the algorithms and about social media, the lack of accountability. And the director of it, Jeff Orlansky, and I were on a panel together right when Elon announced he was doing this. And we got asked that question, and both of us agreed there's certain opportunities that come with taking a system like that private. So a lot of the stuff that I recommend, or like I advocate for, things like saying, should you have to click on a link to reshare it? If you require someone to click on a link, you get 10 or 15% less misinformation. But it's also going to cost you like 0.1% of profit. It's not free. Twitter has decided to do this in the past. Facebook hasn't. It doesn't censor anyone, right? All content is treated equally, but you get much less misinformation. Going private opens up a large tool chest of interventions like that are about the design of the systems, design of the algorithms. And the fact that he's come, and you can do it because you're not having to report your profit every single quarter. Doing those changes, I think, makes your company more long-term successful because it's a more pleasant place to be. But it's going to give you slight losses in the short term. I think the reason why I'm optimistic about this is Elon Musk has shown for years that he's willing to ask hard questions and accept hard answers. Like you can't have a rocket blow up and get back on your feet and launch the next one successfully unless you're willing to like really look hard at things. And I think that really sets him apart from Mark Zuckerberg. The secondary thing is the first 2 things he said he wanted to do. The first was he said, I want to publish the algorithms. We all deserve to see what's in there. And the second thing he said was, I want to take all the robots off Twitter. So for those who aren't aware, there are little programs that pretend to be human beings on Twitter. And they're on basically every other consumer site as well. And they're literally the most dangerous thing about social media. Because the people who are weaponizing social media, people like Russia, China, Iran, they extensively use these automated humans, these fake humans, to amplify out the messages that are useful to them. And there are lots and lots of tools for taking down these accounts. But when you have a public company, and if you'll notice, the reason why the deal hasn't gone through yet is Elon said, hey, it looks awfully suspicious that you've said every quarter for a number of years that 5% of your users are bots. I think you don't know how many of your users are real. And that's true. And it's because every single time you take a robot off Twitter, you have one less user, right? The value of your company went down a little bit. And for those who don't watch the price of tech companies really carefully, if you lose 1% of users, sometimes your stock falls 10%. It can fall 15%. And so there's a real cost to doing the right thing for a public company. But the fact that Elon said, let's take the bots off, shows he's talking to people who know something about what's going on.
So, and the final question we ask everyone is, what is the worst advice you've ever been given?
So the boomers really always said, like, you need to buy a house, you need to buy a house, you need to buy a house. The single worst thing I ever did in my life was I bought a house. And because I bought a house, when I bought a house, so I bought it at a very, very wise time economically. Like, I bought it in 2010, like at the very bottom of the market. But because I renovated a house in my 20s, it meant that when I got hospitalized, I had almost no money. Like, I had spent all the savings I had gotten from working in tech in my 20s on renovating this house, right? Because I'd bought a foreclosed and a condemned house because it was all I could afford in California. And because of that, I went back to work after I was sick way too soon. Like, I went back to work 2 weeks after I stopped walking with a cane. And it was because I was out of money. And so now I always tell people, I know you want to buy a house. I know you really want to. I know it feels crazy watching the price of houses get higher and higher and higher. But, like, just don't buy a house before you're 30. Just don't. Just wait. I know you want it. I know you want stability. Just build up the war chest higher. Because I really wish I had had more flexibility during that time period.
Thank you, Frances.